Good evening. I'm Jennifer Rabb, and I have the great privilege of serving as president of Hunter College, where the American dream continues to come true on campus and online 151 years after our founding. Before beginning this evening's program, I want to take the opportunity as the spring semester comes to an end to recognize the dedication of our Hunter students and faculty who have made this such a productive period of learning and teaching despite the challenges of isolation and separation. As we prepare for a return to campus in the fall, we remain grateful to the entire Hunter community for your perseverance and ongoing commitment to education and excellence. One of the many ways in which we have continued to embody our historic Hunter motto, Mihi Cura Futuri, the care of the future is mine, is by caring about the history that has helped shape our world and our society. To that end, historic Roosevelt House remains a hub not just for consideration of the most critical issues of today, but for exploring the most significant and singular lessons and lives of the past. Tonight, to guide us in doing just that, we could not be more excited to welcome back to Roosevelt House the director of Hunter's Jewish Studies Center, Dr. Leah Garrett, for a discussion and celebration of her riveting and groundbreaking new book, X-Troop, The Secret Jewish Commandos of World War II, which comes out tomorrow. A page-turner as much as a revelatory history, X-Troop chronicles for the first time the astonishing saga of the German Jewish commandos who fought in Britain's most secretive World War II Special Forces unit. Dr. Garrett's deep and pioneering research, including interviews with surviving members of the troop, reveals the fascinating backgrounds of individual commandos, among them an Olympic athlete and a diplomat's son. In addition, her meticulous investigation brings to light the details of how and why their escape from Europe and capture in the United Kingdom as enemy aliens led to the original creation of X-Troop. The book is already receiving exuberant praise and interest. Publishers Weekly has said that its skillful use of primary sources helps to shine a well-deserved spotlight on its heroic subjects. And author Stephen J. Zipperstein has called it a masterful work combining the skill of a superb storyteller and the precision of a first-rate scholar, an extraordinary portrait of heroism and human decency amid horror. With X-Troop, Dr. Garrett adds to her prolific output as a nationally recognized Jewish studies scholar and writer. Her previous books include the acclaimed Young Lions, How Jewish Authors Reinvented the American War Novel, which won the 2017 Jordan Schnitzer Book Award for Modern Jewish History and was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. When she is not caring for the future as a scholar, author, and historian, Leah is doing so by directing the vast range of activities hosted by Hunter's Jewish Studies Center. Under Leah's extraordinary leadership and vision, the center has become an essential engine of Jewish culture and scholarship, ensuring the place of Jewish studies throughout the academic disciplines. In addition, the center presents a series of public lectures and public programs, most recently a live Zoom klezmer concert. Hunter students involved at the Jewish Studies Center are also given the opportunity to learn experientially through internships at top Jewish cultural organizations and courses based on the streets of New York, where walking tours provide the curriculum. And next summer, the center is expanding and leading its Hebrew language program, safety permitting, to bring Hebrew students on a special research trip to Israel. We want to take this opportunity to thank one of our extraordinary alums, Eva Cooper, for her support for the Jewish Studies Center, which makes so much of this possible. Thank you, Eva. To speak with Leah tonight, we are so pleased to welcome another star of the Hunter faculty, Professor of History Benjamin Hett, who has done his own recent Hunter at Home on an acclaimed book, his Nazi Menace, Hitler, Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, and the Road to War. Before that, for an in-person conversation about his earlier work, we welcomed him to Roosevelt House to discuss the death of democracy, Hitler's rise to power, and the downfall of the Weimar Republic. Dr. Hett's book, Crossing Hitler, The Man Who Put the Nazis on the Witness Stand, was made into a documentary film and a television drama for the BBC. So you can see this is a formidable duo, two of Hunter's most brilliant minds and best teachers, who also happen to be among the world's most accomplished scholars of the World War II era. Through the stories their work uncovers, they help us to see both the past and the present in a new way. So, Dr. Hett, I'm so grateful that you can be with us to celebrate Leah's new book, and I could not be more pleased or more proud to hand the program over to you, two amazing Hunter faculty members and distinguished authors. Please join me in welcoming Professor Benjamin Hett in conversation with Dr. Leah Garrett. Thank you.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome very much to today's session. And thank you to President Rabb for that extremely kind introduction. I would like to say it's certainly a great pleasure and a great honor for me to have the chance to be here today to have this conversation with Leah Garrett about her terrific new book. Just a couple of notes by way of introduction. I should just mention, if you haven't noticed already, that in the chat, you'll have an opportunity to see a link which will enable you to purchase this book from Shakespeare and Company. And if you do that, it will come along with a bookplate signed by Leah. So we will sort of replicate as best we can the book signing experience that we usually have with these events. And I would also like to note that information just came to us over the weekend that Leah's book has already hit official bestseller status in the United Kingdom. This is after being serialized in the Daily Mail, the UK's best-selling paper. I'm sure that this is going to happen in the United States when the book is officially released here. It is, as President Rabb said, a real spellbinding read, along with being a great work of scholarship. It's incredibly readable. I told Leah a few days ago that when I sat down to read it, I started one evening after supper, and I ended up being up late, quite late that night, because I got so absorbed in it. So let me just strongly recommend that to everybody. So let's get down to business, Leah. Let me just start by asking you, can you just tell us a little bit, basically, what was X-Troop? What was this unit?
Okay, thank you. And thank you everyone for coming. And I just want to do a couple of really quick thank yous. Thank you, Benjamin, for doing this with me, and Jennifer Rabb for bringing me to Hunter, which I always say, I feel like I won the lottery getting to be at Hunter. I love it. I love our students. And also to the Roosevelt House and Harold Holzer, and for organizing this, and to Magda and Daniel and Mac for helping run this event. And finally, I'm really delighted to say that a number of children of commandos are attending tonight. So thank you, family members as well, for coming. So the X-Troop was created in 1942 when Britain was really struggling to beat the Germans, and Churchill, working with Combined Operations, decided that they would create a secret commando unit of refugees who spoke German fluently. And because the majority of those, almost every single member of the troop, were Jewish, it meant that every member of the X-Troop had a very deep connection and rage towards Germany and Austria, because all of the members of the X-Troop had come as teenagers, mostly on Kindertransport, with no parents, had lost everything that they cared about. And when they came here and the war broke out, they were all interned as enemy aliens because they were German. And so the way that they what they saw was that the British military could really use them to fight against the Nazis. So this secret commando unit was created, and they underwent intense training for a year in Wales and Scotland. All of them had to take on fake British names and fake British personas, because if they were captured, not only were they going to be killed, but their families, if there were any left in Europe, would probably be killed as well. And then when the war broke out, they were the tip of the spear at all the major battles, leading the way. And because they were trained both as commandos and in counterintelligence, what it meant was that they could do interrogations on the battlefield, which led to crucial information during the war that had a direct impact on the win of the Allies. And then after the war, the majority of the men were also used for the denazification efforts. So that's very short, and I know we're going to talk in more detail, but they were all Holocaust survivors, German and Austrian Jews, who had suffered horrendous loss and then had the opportunity to fight against the Nazis.
Okay, so there's so much here that's so interesting. Let's start getting into some of this. But I want to actually start with a sort of history geek question in a sense. Now, as President Raab noted in the introduction, your last book was on Jewish American soldier writers who their work sort of distilled some of the essence of the Second World War, the American experience. And I can see certain elements of sort of how you might segue from that project to this, but I'm always curious how people find their projects. So can you tell us, how did you come across XTroop? What led you to discover this unit? What led you to want to write about it?
Well, I thought my next book was going to be on Mad Magazine because I was also obsessed with Mad Magazine as well as World War II. I had been interviewed for the PBS documentary G.I. Jew, and I went to the premiere of it at the Center for Jewish History. And as I rode the subway home, I thought, I'm not writing on Mad Magazine. I got to keep writing on World War II. And so I started to look for a topic, and I'd heard this sort of rumor about this commando unit, and I read a little bit about it online, and I thought, I got to order that book. And then I had that moment where I thought, holy crap, I get to write that book. So from there, it went really quickly. As I met different commando families, it was like everyone was waiting for somebody to write this book, and they could not have been more generous and excited about it. So within the matter of a year, I had a huge wealth of material, both from families and discovering a lot of the stuff had been put in archives. And very luckily, a great military historian in the UK, Ian Deere, had done a bunch of interviews of the men in the 80s, and they were at the Imperial War Museum. But also a lot of the men had been interviewed for, like, Stephen Ambrose's books they were interviewed for. So a lot of these interviews were out there in a range of different places and different archives. And then as I started the process, I learned fairly quickly that there was actually 2 commandos also still alive. And I knew that the clock was ticking and I had to talk to them fast. So I was very lucky and able to interview them as well during the process of writing the book. But it just flowed from sort of that moment where I thought, oh my God, I get to write this book. Oh my God, I get to write this book. So that's what happened.
I think that's what happens when you have the perfect project. As you were explaining that to us, I was thinking, I've been a World War II geek since I was about 10 years old, which is quite a long time ago now, I have to say. And I had never, as far as I can recall, come across anything about this unit, not that I had noticed at any rate, until I read your book. And this leads me to wonder, and maybe you could comment on this, why is it, do you suppose, that this book was there for you to write, 75 years after the end of World War II? Why had this not been taken up by other writers before?
Well, it's complicated. One reason is because it quickly became apparent to the British military that these ex-troopers were phenomenal and had all the skills that they wanted. There was a decision made right before the invasion of Normandy, and actually earlier, before the Sicily campaign, that this unit would never fight together as a cohesive unit. So what they would do is parcel them out in 2s and 3s to other existing commando units, which meant when you wrote a book about this, the X-Troop existed in training, but then 2 would be here, 3 would be there, 4 would be there. And it kind of dissipated the story a little bit. So what it forced me to do, which I found far too pleasurable, and maybe Benjamin, you understand this as somebody interested in World War II, was getting to spend a huge amount of time going through the British war diaries, talking about the different campaigns of every different commando unit. So it was a huge task. And I think one reason it wasn't written as a book was because of that, because they never fought as their own unit. The other reason was that the majority of the men never changed their names back, and they remained those people after the war. And so it was like there was no one, some of them wrote biographies and autobiographies, really amazing ones, but no one had put everything together before. So it was quite disparate what happened after the war. I think primarily because of the very strange and important nature of this unit was they were so important that they had to fight in 2s and 3s.
That in itself is a remarkable part of the story. And, as you're explaining all this, it's fascinating to think just how scattered all these records were. Obviously, in your research, you interviewed a lot of people, you went to all these various different archival sources. I'm familiar with unit diaries from the German side, actually, but I don't think I've ever looked at British ones. Can you tell us what kind of information does such a thing convey? When you're looking at that source, what are you getting out of it?
Oh, that's a great question. So it would be something like this. I would have an interview with somebody like Ian Harris, right, who was this really incredible Jewish warrior in World War II, and he would talk about different. He talked about sort of going up a hill and the spotlight came on, and then he was injured and he captured a German. And I would have the vague date of it. I would know what unit he was with. I would know approximately how many people had died from his oral interview, but I need to know that this was factual and when and where it was based. So then what I would do is I would get that troop's diary, and some diaries were very austere and would say things like, like June 11th, battle for Hill, 3 dead. But other diaries, especially the one for the Walk-Heron campaign, were poetic and would talk about when the men are going through the dunes, the sand is going in their nose and their ears. Can you imagine what this felt like? And these were all written anonymously, just probably by some person who was given the task of it. 90% of them were very dry dates, numbers, names, but incredibly helpful to me because I had it all there. But 10%, I mean, I keep thinking this is what I should write the next book on, were utterly poetic and just filled with emotions, especially the descriptions of landing at Sword Beach and the blood carnage that happened there. Some unit diaries would just do the numbers and the facts. Others would talk in pretty good detail about what it felt like to be there.
That's chilling.
It was chilling, yeah.
All right, let's talk a little bit about some of these amazing men whose stories you tell in this book. Now, as you indicated at the outset, these were by and large German or Austrian, or I think in one or two cases, Hungarian Jews who made their way to Britain. And none of them had an easy time in doing that. Can you tell a little bit about the story of how they went from being refugees to making the transition into being these commandos?
Yeah, and at the end, we're going to show some photos. So some of these names, you'll get to see what they look like. So the majority of them had parents who saw the writing on the wall. And as we all know, in Germany and Austria, you couldn't get out even if you wanted to at one point because there was nowhere to go. But one place they could go was that these Kindertransports were organized, mostly through the UK, through religious organizations. So the majority of them would say their last goodbyes to their parents in a train station in Berlin or wherever it was, and would be sent by themselves. The rest of them would just, like Manfred Ganz, his parents put him on a train and he made his way over. And then they would get to the UK. The problem is they were still stateless refugees. So then they would be put into care, maybe in an orphanage, maybe working on a farm, whatever it would be. And then and they're all itching to fight the Nazis, like absolutely itching to fight the Nazis. But then what happens is when the war breaks out, Churchill did an infamous quote, "collar the lot." And the idea was that that there might be a untrustworthy column of traitors within the British population who were the Germans. So they decided what they would do was round up and intern primarily single German men, tens of thousands of which were Jews. So they were put in internment. The better places were like on the Isle of Man. The worst and most horrific places were in Canada and Australia. And I actually interviewed one of the survivors from Australia when they were put on a shockingly awful ship to Australia with anti-Semitic guards. And one of the guys told me how he had to walk over glass because it was a big joke. And they got to Australia and then they were put in the outback in a camp for up to a year until this idea was pulled back after Pearl Harbor. Then the men were given the only option to join the military. They all wanted to join the military. Because they were still enemy aliens, they could only join the Pioneer Corps, which was the hard labor people who built the roads and were not given guns. And then this idea comes to Churchill in 1942 and little signs start appearing at Pioneer Corps places, the heads of the Pioneer Corps said, "Do you know any like German-speaking guys who are like really smart and capable?" And all of them had this assortment of men who had been constantly agitating to get a gun and go to war and fight the Nazis. So then they were all sent to London. They were interviewed by MI5 over a matter of days, and those who were selected were then sent over to Wales. And within the span of 10 minutes, they all had to take on fake British names, British personas. Like they got online and they had to walk into the office and what's your new name? And these were guys who like their name was their connection to their families and their past, and it was all gone. And they had to get rid of all of their books that had their names and everything and pretend that they were these new British people. And originally X Troop was called the British Troop because they were pretending to be British. I mean, and so then they were trained for a year, 2 years, a few months, whatever it was, and then they were sent on different missions. But they'd gone through waves of trauma. I mean, losing their families and then the internments. And then finally they were given the chance to fight back. And man, did they ever actually at that point.
I want to just underscore or ask you to underscore a couple of the points here, because I think there are aspects of this story that would just seem absolutely bizarre, I think, to many people, as they seemed to me when I first encountered some of these things. So for instance, let's just underscore that the story that you tell so sort of horrifyingly in the book about this one ship taking some of these men to Australia. Now let's note here, it's a British ship with British crews. These are the people fighting the Nazis, but these anti-Semitic crew members are torturing these young Jewish men by making them walk over glass.
And also on the ship and in the internment camps, these Jews are being placed with German soldiers who have been captured, who enjoy nothing more than singing Nazi songs to them. So I mean, it's and when they're put on the Daenerys ship, everything that they ever had is taken away and thrown overboard. Just it's all gone.
And so another thing that I think many people might have trouble grasping is, and going back to another aspect that you mentioned here, and that is that, so you have in 1940 or so, you have these young men who have come to Britain as refugees from the Nazis, but who are being interned as enemy aliens. Why were the British so unable to perceive that these, German Jewish refugees were going to be quite different in outlook from, say, a non-Jewish German who had ended up in the UK for whatever reason?
I think that the parts of the British press, as with parts of the American press at this point, were highly xenophobic. And there was an agitation against immigrants and others, this same kind of stuff we've been seeing over the last few years. And they were considered to be potentially a fifth column. And there wasn't any discussion or consideration that, the vast majority of them were Jewish. I think it was just sort of an easy little out that they did, even though it was a huge amount of manpower, wasted manpower to do this. But they were so oblivious to it, like I said, that they would put them in camps, the Jewish refugees with the German prisoners. So, I mean, it was absolutely toxic and horrific. But once they were given their guns and their uniforms, to a man, the commandos felt gratitude to the Brits for allowing them to take the war back to the enemy. So there was bad feelings about the internment, but it was never a major focus for any of the men who told me, whose stories were told or who told me their stories.
Okay, so let's turn to some of these men, because the stories are really amazing. Can you just give us a few examples of some of the individual people you write about and their stories, going from Nazified Germany into the UK?
Sure. So I'll start with Ian Harris, and I think his son might be listening today, so hopefully he's here. Ian Harris was the definition of a hard man, a hard ass, and he had been raised in Germany, and he was Jewish, and his parents had put him in a school in Germany, which ended up being a hotbed of German socialism. So the kids he went to school with were completely anti-Semitic, and But what was really interesting was while he was there, because it was like a German military school, he learned German military things that would help him fight in the war, which he would utilize when he was fighting the same guys who had tormented him when he was a kid as a Jew. Once the war breaks out, he's always at the front lines, battling, trying to get back at these Nazis who had destroyed his family and his life entirely. And he leads the fight in all of these different situations. In one, during the Rhine crossing, he single-handedly takes on a bunch of the most fanatical Hitler Jugend, which were the Hitler Youth, who were the most fanatical. And it's like out of a movie as he's going forth with his machine gun and he's pushing them and he's fighting them. And this is after a previous event in which he managed to get an entire German platoon to surrender by charming the commanding officer of that platoon. So he was very charming and also a very adept fighter. And his military medal said that no, we've never seen anybody like this guy before. And he was absolutely dedicated until he was injured at the very end of the war. And then after the war, he was very important in the commando organizations as well. Another person is Peter Masters, who was this beautiful artist from Vienna. And when the Anschluss happened, his family, as with everybody, lost everything, and they saw the writing on the wall. And his mother managed to get him and his sister out when he was quite young. He wanted to be an artist, and he was an incredible artist. So during the war, he kept these diaries of training that are exquisite. And I have pictures in the book from the paintings he did. And so throughout the whole war, he's doing these diaries and these drawings. But when they land at D-Day, he is given the option of being in the bicycle troop. And the bicycle troop was sent to go to right in front on these awful, heavy, terrible bikes to get to the front, to get to Pegasus Bridge, right? So Pegasus Bridge, the most iconic thing we know of D-Day, longest day. Our Jewish boy from Vienna is at the front of the bridge, riding across and leading the way. And he was absolutely, totally heroic during Normandy and D-Day, and ends up saving the life of Lord Lovat himself, the great Lord Lovat. And as well with him, after the war, he goes on to have a beautiful and long, successful life as an artist, but also somebody who's devoted to issues of poverty. All of them went on to issues of poverty. And then, of course, there's the story of Montfort Gowns, which I can tell now or later because that is so epic. Should I tell you that story?
Yeah, I definitely want to get to it, but maybe chronologically.
We'll wait on that one.
Let's work up to it because it's an amazing story.
But I just have to say, can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
As I was writing this book and I was writing each chapter, like I wrote this Dieppe chapter with all this crazy stuff at Dieppe, and as I wrote each chapter, I think I said this to you before, Benjamin, I would say, holy shit, did they really do this? Oh my God, this chapter is like a crazy book that is extraordinary. But each chapter was like that. They were at the forefront of everything, doing extraordinary things that changed the course of the war.
This is why the book kept me up at night. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about some of these operations and some of the things specifically that these guys did. Let's start with Dieppe, because since I grew up in Canada, Dieppe holds a certain place in my affections, if that's the right way to put it. So can you just say a little bit what the Dieppe raid was and then talk about what role some of these men played in it?
Yeah, so the Dieppe raid was an infamous slaughter of Canadian and British troops. And it was considered a very poorly judged raid on a port in France that was sort of to show, to kind of get the commandos to get practice, to show that, potentially the Allied forces had some toughness to it. But it was always seemed to be very misjudged because it was an absolute downright slaughter. Well, a few years ago, a couple of historians started questioning this and saying that perhaps Dieppe was a cover for a different operation, which was to pinch, is the term for it, an Enigma machine. And the Enigma machines were the machines that were used to decode what the Germans were up to. And they already had a 3-motor machine, but they needed to get the 4-motor machine because to have the war in the Atlantic and to be successful, they need to know where the German U-boats were. So it's really crucial to get this. So these historians started saying, well, maybe because there was a German headquarter there that potentially had the Enigma machine, maybe it was a cover for this. And that sort of made sense to me. And then it started to really make sense to me because it turned out that the first iteration of X-Troopers was this handful of Czechoslovakian X-Troopers, all fluent in German, who were handpicked out of special operations to come and train. And they trained and they went along with it. And I kept thinking, that's very strange. Why did they need these German speakers? What was this about? Until I found this top secret after action report in which one of them said, we were sent there to go to German headquarters to get a respirator, which I think was the one of the Enigma machines. And the person organizing all this to make it even more theatrical was, of course, Ian Fleming, the great spy novelist. He was in charge of all this. So they did send these 5 early X-Troopers to Dieppe. And it was catastrophic for them as well. They tried to get the Enigma machine, but only one of them came back unhurt, Maurice Latimer, who will end up playing a huge role with the X-Troopers going forward. And later I have a picture of Maurice Latimer. But I think that they were sent there undercover as German speakers to grab the Enigma machine. And all the documentation I have suggests this. And one other point, one of the person who's training them at this point is George Lane, who is a whole other story about how he was so important for D-Day. His wife at this point is Miriam Rothschild of the Rothschilds. She at this point is working at Bletchley Park, decoding Enigma information. So there's all of these ties there that suggest very strongly that that's why these guys were sent and potentially why the X-Troop was founded at the start as well.
And her brother, Miriam Rothschild's brother, worked
Yeah.
for MI5, one of the British intelligence services. So there's
Yeah,
all these kind of interesting little loops here.
yeah. Exactly.
I was really intrigued by the case you made in that chapter on how the point of Dieppe might have been to get an Enigma machine, because I know this idea has been circulating in the literature lately, but it seems to me one of the many contributions of your book is to add an important piece of evidence about this. So it sounds to me like you are fairly sure that that was the purpose.
I'm fairly certain there was no other reason for them to be there. And then I found this quote by somebody who was working with Ian Fleming talking about giving these guys a bunch of money to go undertake their mission. And there's no other rhyme or reason, especially with that after action report,
Yeah.
saying we were being sent to the German headquarters to get this thing. Yeah.
To get a respirator.
A respirator.
You're not going to mount a commando raid to get a respirator. So
Yeah. And I remember a few years ago, Benjamin and I had lunch and I said, what do you think about this respirator? Like, is there like a German respirator? And I'm sure it was an Enigma machine.
It doesn't sound like they got it though, as far as I can tell.
No.
Right? They must have not been able to find it, or
Yeah, nothing good came out of that operation, except for Lord Lovett's troops, who were the only ones who came back pretty much alive.
right. Okay. So then what did the X-Troop men go on to after Dieppe? Dieppe is August 42, so it's fairly early in their time of active service. What happened to these guys after that?
Okay, so then this is when they, like a week after Dieppe is when they bring in the big intake of X-Troopers and they start interviewing all them, and then they send them all out to Wales, but because they're commandos don't bill it with like in a dorm. They bill it with locals. So they give them some money and say, go into this Welsh town of Aberdyfi and find yourself a house. And so they went and lived with all these Welsh villagers. They, as one of them said in a later interview, they would always say, but we are English. I mean, all the villagers knew something weird was up here, but they didn't question it. And these boys had to get rid of everything they had and pretend to be this new persona of this name that they had just made up. And some trained for a few months, some trained for a few years. While this is all happening, they're being sent on operations behind enemy lines, which I'm still trying to get more information on, but I have little bits and things about this person and that person. But the two big things that they do at this point is a group of 4 of them are sent for the Sicily invasion on the very first boats landing in Sicily. And I think it was sort of to test the mettle of these guys, including a guy named Colin Anson, who I write a lot about in the book, whose dad had been killed at Dachau. Again, terrible story. And he was pretty sensitive and he turned into a hell of a commander. So they're over at Sicily. And then in the days before D-Day, one of the men, George Lane, who's the one who's married to Miriam Rothschild, who's one of the guys training the men, is sent to land at Normandy on a little boat. and try and figure out if the Germans have a new type of mine that they're using on the coast, which potentially could stop D-Day. And so he's given the task to go land there and actually bring a mine back with him. And he goes there and he realizes, and he's the water polo guy from the Olympics, and he realized, so he's very adept in water, and he dives and he realizes the mines are just standard teller mines. There's nothing big going on here. And so during the third landing, gives the information back to the headquarters, and they say, no, there's something else. So they send him a third time. He's right. It's just a teller mine. He's captured with another commando he's with, and they're brought to a castle, and he's interviewed by General Rommel himself, actually. And he doesn't give anything away. He keeps his cover. It's an incredible story. Rommel wrote about it in a letter. I had all the secondary information, but because of that information he got from the first 2 dives, he also got a medal. And the medal said, because of what George Lane did, we were able to do the invasion as planned. So there you go. And each of them, it's like these stories of what they did, and all of them, to a man, in every instance, they were determined to win the war, no matter if it meant their own personal sacrifice.
That story of meeting Rommel is one of those things that I think, you read this and you think, this is like one of those movies like The Great Escape or something, or The Longest Day, or something just amazing but impossible to believe happens. And yet this actually happened. This young commando ended up face to face with Erwin Rommel and was sort of interrogated by Rommel himself. It's really quite remarkable.
Yeah, it's in Marco, and he talked about like the treatment of the Jews and stuff.
Yeah.
And the funny part is, because he's of course a German speaker, George Lane, and he realizes they're going to suss out his accent when he's pretending to speak English, because he knows some of them are fluent English speakers. So he decides to do a fake Welsh accent that sounds really weird to cover his German accent. And it worked. They didn't figure it out. Oh, and then he's taken as a prisoner of war. And he actually, when he gets there, they of course figure out, they think he's a German stooge or something, but he tells them the story. And he gives them the information that he saw out of his blindfold about where Rommel's headquarters were. And they transmit it by a secret radio back to London. And a couple months later, Rommel's car is hit, and Rommel's effectively out of the war.
Again, so he may have played a role in doing it to Rommel, which again is a significant contribution to Allied victory, it must be said.
Yes, it really was.
All right, so let's talk about D-Day and the operations that these men then are involved in once the landings on the European continent have happened in the last phase of the war. What can you tell us about that?
About D-Day? So, like I said, they're all different units, all landing at Sword Beach, right? So they're in 2s and 3s. And there's this great quote in Peter Masters' amazing autobiography called Striking Back, where he says, where other soldiers drew straws to see who got to stay back, we drew straws to see who got to go forth. So they were always putting their hands up for the most dangerous operations. Every single time they put their hand up. And because of this, they became leaders of all the different commando units that they were with. Manfred Ganz ended up being at the forefront of capturing these very crucial German radar stations. And being the person who was at the front of the line. He went there at night, he got in there, he gathered the information, very steely and determined. And then they got these central sort of radio towers. They were at the forefront of capturing French villages. They were always there, the guys going behind enemy lines to gather information too. And then when they would capture people, because of their German skills, they would get intel right then. So like when Manfred Ganz, he lands on Sword Beach with his commando unit, absolute carnage, half of the unit is wiped out. He is so determined, he goes up to the beach, he sees 25 German men there, and he immediately starts interrogating them in German to find the route through the minefields off the beach, and then he leads everyone behind him to safety. And this is what they're doing constantly. And then as they move forward through Normandy and make their way across, to the Rhine, these guys are always on the front boats. even for the crossing of the Rhine, it's Peter Masters, the sensitive artist from Vienna, who interrogates with Harris, the other person I mentioned, two captured German intelligence officers, and they get this information exactly where the Germans are hiding. They send it back to the bombers on the Allied sides, and while Peter Masters is sitting there, he hears the bombs go over and land, and they wipe out all the Germans, and they're able to continue in through Germany.
Mm.
So it's this combination of like these warrior fighters and these skilled, brilliant counterintelligence officers who all knew that the clock was ticking. Like, I have to say this, this was personal. I mean, it was general, personal. As Peter Masters said, we had to get there fast because anyone who's left is being killed. Like, there's no taking time on any of this. It's their families they're getting to.
Right. Yeah. So there are a couple of things here that I thought were particularly fascinating. One of the points that you make strongly in the book is that these men fought the war very much as individuals. You know, they were not participating in the war in the way of an infantryman who is part of a huge unit, sort of one cog in a huge unit. For these men, it was a very individualistic war in which their skills could have full play. Their linguistic abilities, their intelligence, as well as their courage, all sort of brought to bear on this. I thought that was a really fascinating aspect of all this.
Yeah, and also the personalness of this. One of the commandos ended up capturing and interrogating somebody who had killed his mother. And what was so extraordinary to me, and the way that the book is actually the complete opposite of Tarantino's Inglourious Bastards, was that in every situation they acted ethically, even when God knows I wouldn't have acted ethically. And they always looked at sort of, they all had ethical backgrounds. They sort of knew how the rules of war were fought. So it was a personal war, but it was also an incredibly legitimate war for them, that they had, you know, this was a step towards this, getting the information. So there's a point in the book where Peter Masters basically realizes that he's being sent in front during the Normandy campaign to figure out where there's a German machine gun nest and to call them out in German. And he actually says to himself, you know, they're probably going to kill me, but it's worth it because we'll be able to take this town. So the sense of personalness was that they always saw the bigger story all the time, that they had to beat the Nazis. And even after the war, there's this incredible moment where Colin Anson, whose dad was killed at Dachau and taken to Dachau, he's part of the denazification efforts. He finds from the police who was the man who was responsible for his father's death. And he says to himself, I could take that guy out into the woods and shoot him, but I'm not going to do that. And he doesn't do that. He just turns him into the police. I mean, it's mind-boggling. So it was deeply personal, but part of this bigger idea of how one conducts oneself.
It is remarkable.
And we're not Nazis. We're not going to fight like them. We're going to do it differently.
It's highly admirable. I don't know if I would have had that level of forbearance in their position, but I think this is now the moment where I think we need to do the Manfred Ganz story. So speaking of this being personal, and speaking of these guys being in a hurry to get the war over to save who could be saved, tell us this amazing story about Manfred Ganz looking for his parents.
Right. Okay. So Manfred Ganz, my God, like what a Superman, and just extraordinary guy. He comes from an Orthodox Jewish family in Borken, Germany. Really loving, warm family. His family sees the writing on the wall. They send him by himself, I think when he's 16, to England. He's obsessed with engineering and wants to be an engineer. But, and he starts doing engineering classes. The war breaks out. He's interned, terrible conditions. But his eye's on the prize, and he has a conversation with a guy in the internment camp where he says, you know, I want to get out of here and fight the Nazis. Remember, he's an Orthodox Jew. And the guy says to him, you know, you can't do that. You'll break the rules of Orthodoxy. And another guy who's like a Jewish scholar says, it's a mitzvah to fight Hitler. And Manfred Ganz says, yep, that's what I'm going to do, no matter what it takes. So he gets out of internment. He goes into the Pioneer Corps. He's agitating constantly to get out and fight. Finally, he's selected to be a commando. And he's not, I mean, these guys are all Superman, but he's like Superman. Like in training, he was winning all the races. He's selected to go to Cambridge to do advanced intelligence training. He's like physically incredible, intellectually incredible. War breaks out. He's lands at D-Day. Like I said, he helps capture this radar. I mean, everything he's doing is just, there's one point at which he actually goes missing behind enemy lines, and the war diary itself says, and they're all under fake names, right? So he's under the name Fred Gray, says something like, Fred Gray went missing. None of us were worried. We knew he'd come back, and he comes back. He gets all this intelligence and he just comes back the next day. But then eventually he gets news that his parents, who are in hiding in the Netherlands, have been captured and put in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. And now he knows the clock is really ticking, and he decides he has to save his parents. And so, but I mean, obviously he can't do that, but he's thinking about that. He writes letters to his girlfriend, who will later be his wife, about this. So last days of the war, he's received information that his parents have been transferred to Theresienstadt concentration camp in Terezin, Czechoslovakia. And before the war has even ended, the day before the war ends, he goes to his commanding officer, who knows that this guy is a Superman, and says, I need a Jeep. And the guy said, are you sure? And he said, yeah, I need a Jeep. And by the way, Manfred keeps a whole diary of this that's at the Holocaust Museum, because I was always verifying everything. And he gets a Jeep. And in the last days of war, he does something nobody has done, which he drives across Germany. I mean, this is when, like, you know, like villagers are rampaging, Russian troops are showing up. It's pure chaos. He has to get to Theresienstadt concentration camp, and he drives. He gets through different checkpoints. He charms his way, keeps going, keeps going, keeps going. He gets to the concentration camp. The Russians have only just liberated it the day before. They say, you can't go in, there's typhoid here. And he says to the guards, he says, you have to let me in, the guard. And they're seeing this British commando, and they say, why? And he says, because I have to find out if my parents are there. They open the doors. They first of all cannot believe there's a Brit across this far into Russian lines. He goes inside. Because the Germans were insane masochists. They keep deep roll calls of who's alive and who's dead. So there's actually a camp office he goes to, and there's a woman there who I think was a Jewish woman, and he says, I've come to find if my parents are here. And she looks through the rolls and she bursts into tears. She says, your parents are here and they're alive. And she takes him to the apartment they're in, and he says, you need to go in first, because like they won't be able to handle this. So she goes in and preps them, and he goes in and he finds his parents. They're starting, they're sick. As he said, he can barely recognize his father, but it doesn't matter. And they spend the whole night talking together. And as they're talking, the news gets out around the camp that a Jew has come back, and everyone's yelling like Mazel Tov, and like just so much hope. Nobody can believe it. Everyone starts bringing hundreds and hundreds of letters for the Red Cross. And the Russians, of course, won't let them leave because of typhoid. So he gives his parents a bunch of supplies. He says, I'm coming back for you. He takes all the Red Cross letters. He drives straight back, picking up starving POWs on the way, because of course it's Montfort-Gans, and that's what he does. He gets back. He immediately drives to get a personal meeting with Princess Juliana of the Netherlands, like the day he gets back. And he says, the Dutch colony, which is where they're put in Theresienstadt, you need to help these people. And she organizes relief, and his parents are rescued. And later I'll show a picture of them, and they live a happy, wonderful life in Israel. And he said after this in a letter, I won my private war, and he rescued his parents.
It's an absolutely amazing story. I think at this point, the only thing we can do is have some pictures. So you're gonna show some pictures and talk us through,
yeah,
so we can see a little bit of what some of these guys look like. So let's go to that now.
Okay, so this is the cover of the book, but the reason I wanted to show it is the guy in the middle holding the Tommy gun. I think his son might be here today. That's Jeff Broadman, who was one of the great warriors of the X Troop, and spent his life in the military, and afterwards also continued to be a great mountain climber. And he was just yet another Superman. So I wanted to show it because the guy in the middle is one of the greatest of the X Troopers. So next, please. So this is the only group photo we have of them. This is in Wales during training with Bully the Bulldog and Brian Hilton Jones, who was their much beloved Welsh commanding officer. So that's the X Troop as a group. Next, please. So this is internment. I think this one is on the Isle of Man, but like I said, it's much worse overseas. Next, please. There's Peter Masters, the Viennese artist in the Pioneer Corps. Amazingly, we have a photo of him doing the menial labor that the guys had to do. Next, please. This is during training. I forgot to mention this, but during training, they did a lot of mountain climbing, jumping from airplanes, and so on and so forth. So I thought that was a great photo of that. Of course, carrying all of their guns and everything else with them. Next, please. That was their Welsh commanding officer, Brian Hilton Jones, who was not Jewish, and he loved these men and they loved him. And when I spoke to one of the surviving commandos, the thing he wanted to show me first was the letter of recommendation from Brian Hilton Jones. I think he became the father figure for these men. And when they were trying to get naturalized, he fought tooth and nail to get his boys naturalized. And they called him the skipper because they loved him so much. Next, please. That's Colin Anson, the man whose dad was killed at Dachau and then leads the Sicily invasion. Next, please. That's George Lane, who has the interview with Rommel. The other guys called him the Hungarian hunk because they thought he was just so superhuman and cute. And he was married to Miriam Rothschild. Next, please. That's the great Peter Masters, who was with the bicycle troop and landed at D-Day and did the beautiful drawings that I have in the book of the landings. Next, please. And that's the bicycle troop. You can see in the back of the image, the bicycles are landing at Sword Beach on D-Day. Next, please. That's Maurice Latimer, the one survivor from Dieppe, who helps Manfred Gans capture Walcheren. And these guys, we didn't really go into that battle, but were really crucial to capturing Walcheren, which meant that the Allies could have a port at Antwerp, which was crucial to the continuation of the war. So that's him on the right. Just one thing to say about this, Peter Masters' note about this picture that we all know that horrific, iconic photograph of the Jewish boy with his hands up with the gun at him. And he said, and he's right, this is our opposite of it. It's the Jewish commandos holding the gun with the German hands up. Next, please. That's Ian Harris. I sort of mentioned on the side, he captured an entire German platoon by talking them into giving up. And that's him in the front in the Jeep leading them out in Osnabrück, Germany. Next, please. That's Manfred Gans, the great Manfred Gans, who the Orthodox German Jew who leads the way in Normandy and then rescues his parents. Next, please. Probably my favorite photo of many in the book. That's him with his parents and brothers in Israel after the war, having gotten them out. Next, please. Oh, I didn't talk about him, but this is Ron Gilbert, who led the denazification efforts after the war. Next, please. That's the great Ian Harris, who I mentioned earlier. And next, please. And that's the cover again. So those are some of the photos. There's a lot, there's about 50 in the book, but that's a handful of them.
Great. Well, the book is so rich and it's so full of unbelievable stories, and we could go on for 2 or 3 more hours. But I think at this point, let's open things up and let's ask folks from the audience to ask some questions. And Mac is going to sort of facilitate that.
Hi, Ben. Hi, Leah. This has been great. There are lots of good questions. I just want to reiterate before I start asking them that audience members can find a link to purchase the book in the chat. Also, congratulations to Leah from the Roosevelt House team on the book, the best-selling success of your book.
Thank you.
Yes. So a few questioners are asking if there are any similarities or interesting contrasts with the Ritchie boys, who I believe were featured on 60 Minutes somewhat recently.
Yeah, and that's a really great question. There's a few similarities, German speakers and exiles from Germany and Jewish, but there's much more differences because the Ritchie boys were counterintelligence officers. And that's the crucial difference with the X Troop. The X Troop were commandos. So they were counterintelligence officers and commandos. So they had to be able to capture the German and then interrogate the German. So the similarity, I think, was the fire that burned in all of their bellies to get back there and right the wrongs that had happened in the world. But what I think made the X Troop was so extraordinary and actually very unusual in World War II. You don't have this happen, that you train commandos to do both at the same time. So they would capture them and then they would do the interrogations and get the information. So that way they were completely and unique and different from the Ritchie boys as well.
A few people are asking about the gender and age of the commandos. Some questioners want to know, were there any women? And others are pointing out that if they came over in the Kinder transports, they must have been quite young.
Okay, that's a great question. So they did come on the Kinder transports, a number of them, but the upper edge of teenage years, so when they were 16 or 17. And then, of course, we have a few years until the war. The majority of them are kids. They're 18, 19 years old. A few of them, like Maurice Latimer, was the oldest. He was like a socialist who had had a life before all this. But the vast majority of them were young. They were 18 and 19 years old. There were no women involved, except they did call Miriam Rothschild the Lady of X Troop because she did stay with them in Wales while they did the training. And she wrote this incredible quote I have in the book where she said, other commandos like are talking about beers. These guys are talking about Schopenhauer. Like she knew who they were, and she devoted her life to like trying to get memorials to them and was an incredible cheerleader for the X Troop. But these were all men. And tragically, for the few older men in the group, there's only a few older men. There was one guy in the group I write about who actually had been married in Germany, and during the course of the war, his wife and 3 children are taken and exterminated. So most of them have lost parents and siblings, and a few of them actually lose their kids as well.
Edith Holzer says your book is fascinating, and she asks, will it be translated into Hebrew?
It will be translated. So far it's getting translated into Hebrew, Russian, and Polish. And honestly, I really want it translated into German because I want the Germans to read about these men and what they did to them. But that hasn't happened yet. But they've only just started the process. But it's coming out with Matar, which is a big Israeli publishing house. I'm not sure when, but it's 100% coming out in Israel as well.
A couple of questions about accents. Did they get rid of their accents? If so, how? If not, did that present problems?
That's a question that I kept thinking to myself, like, especially when those villagers said, we are all English. Some of them managed to, others, let me give you an example. So, like I said, I managed to interview 2 living commandos. Both, unfortunately, have died while I wrote the book. One was this world famous economist called Paul Streeton, who I interviewed for the book. The other was an elderly gentleman. I interviewed him when he was 96 years old. And he had never told anyone that he was actually a German Jew, or that, as he said to me, his parents had disappeared without a trace. He had taken on the pseudonym he was given in the war, as did a number of them. This was actually pretty common what he did with a number, as well as a number of them. And he didn't look back, and he didn't want to talk about it until I come knocking at his door, and we have a beautiful day together, and he tells me all these stories and shows me all this documentation. And when I was sitting with him, I was thinking, he had a perfect American accent, but whenever he talked about World War II and what had happened to his family, it got very heavily German. And I could see sort of psychologically what was happening there. And I think British society was too polite to ask. Local police would, like when they were in Wales, the local police were told the real story. The villagers knew the story, but they never interrogated the men about it. And I think that they understood that this was just a secret that we're not going to go into. So it did present a problem, but not as much as one would have thought that it presented. Also, because you have to remember, war is so chaotic and crazy that this just might have seemed like they all created backstories, by the way. I should have said that they all had backstories for their German accents. My dad was in the diplomatic corps. I had a German nanny. So they each had a precise story to tell about why they had that kind of accent.
Let's see. A question from I hope this questioner will forgive the pronunciation, Michi Rab. Were these men involved at all in the formation of Israel?
Manfred Gans is one of his brother, I think, had something to do with that, but no, as far as I know, they were not. As far as I know, the vast majority emigrated either to the United States or Canada. They didn't go to Israel, and some of them went back to Australia. But I couldn't find any records of, maybe one or two ended up in Israel, but I don't think they were part of that narrative. They were much part of the American story and the Canadian story.
Robert Rosenberg asks, how many were killed in combat?
So originally, the core group was 87 men, and more than half of them, because these guys were the bravest of the brave, were either killed or captured or disappeared without a trace, which happened to a number of them too. So it was an incredibly high mortality rate. And I was lucky I got to focus on those who survived, because also our, information stays with those who survive much more than those who don't. But through the survivors, I was also able to tell the stories of those who died, often in the last days of the war. It was absolutely heartbreaking.
Also, Paula asks, did any of the commandos ever get to use their former names after the war?
So as far as I could tell, of those, the 48 or whatever it was who survived the war, Manfred Gans, the Orthodox Jewish man, switches back to his original name. Another Orthodox Jewish man who immigrates to the United States switches back, and one British man switches back. As far as I can tell, everyone else, every single one else, kept their names. And I've thought a lot about it, and I think I understand why you would do something like that, because their old name is associated with all of them with such horrific trauma. It's like the name of their mom or their dad. I understand why, like, when they're 18, they take on this new persona, and that's who they become at the point in which they're becoming adults and reinventing themselves, being forced to reinvent themselves. And so the vast majority of their children and grandchildren have the nom de guerre that they picked in those 10 minutes of transition that happened. And also quite a number of them never knew or they never told their children that they were Jewish as well. They kept the Church of England persona as well. And those who were killed in war, one of the horrific aspects of the stories were buried under crosses until after the war. Some Jewish historians worked to get some of those crosses turned to Stars of David for those families who wanted that.
We actually have a comment here from Manfred's daughter, Aviva Gans.
Oh, hi, Aviva.
Yes, thanks for joining us, Aviva. She says, we were told that one reason they were given Welsh identities is so that the Germans would accept that their accents were different should they be captured.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah, thank you, Aviva. And can I just say, the children of the commandos have been the most generous and phenomenal people in the world, letting me into their homes, sharing diaries and photographs, and just sharing everything they had with me, memoirs, all these things. So thank you, Aviva.
Stephen Gutman asks, did any of these amazing leaders and warriors go on to Israel and positions of importance in the Israeli military government?
Yeah, as Genna is like, I can tell, yeah, the majority emigrated to the United States or the majority actually stay in the UK, but those who emigrate tended to come to the US and to Canada. I think they just wanted a peaceful life afterwards. I mean, their post-war lives were all extraordinary as they were, but there was a real, like Maurice Latimer, I only recently found out what happened to him. He was the guy at Dieppe who was at the forefront of every battle. And one of his relatives said, all he wanted after the war was just to relax. And he became like a pharmacist or something. And I got that. I was like, yeah, I totally understand that.
Actually, if I could just interject, a fair number stayed in the British Armed Forces or afterwards, right?
Yes, exactly. Sorry. So after the war, they're all put for the denazification efforts for a year or two until they're sent home. And then a number like Jeff Broadman, he spends his life in the British military, as do a bunch of them, and become really important in the British military.
This is a very specific question from Gabriel. Were the bicycles used motorized?
Oh no, they were awful, the bicycles. A fellow commando from a different unit, when he saw the boys on the bikes at D-Day, said, I can't think of anything worse to go into war on than one of these bikes. They were these big, clunky, the pedals folded up so you could carry them. But the thing that Peter Masters wrote about was you had, these guys had these backpacks with, all their gears and guns and ammunition and ropes. And the only place you could put it when you ride was on the front. But the only place it could sit on the front, of course, would make the wheels stop. And as Peter Masters said, the wheels were always stopping when someone was shooting at you from a church. So they were terrible, terrible, terrible. But it got them to Pegasus Bridge before anybody else.
Let's see. Another question from Gabriel. For those who wore dog tags, did they have their religion on them?
Peter Masters' daughter told me a couple days ago she still has the dog tag. The dog tags all said Church of England, which is why they're all buried. They were all buried under crosses. Nobody knew any of these guys were Jewish. Some people could sort of suss out that maybe they were German, but they completely hid the fact that they were Jewish. They had to. Even Manfred Ganz, who's Orthodox, he had to stop doing anything of Jewish ritual to hide this fact.
Okay. How about just a couple more before we wrap up? Does that sound okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Peter Dixon asks, well, he says first that he's working on a book about the special operations executive in Austria involving Austrian exiles, many of whom were Jewish. Is there any crossover with the men and women you have written about? The experience seems quite similar.
The guys who were sent to Dieppe were all in SOE, were all in Special Operations Executive, as was George Lane. But that was only the first group. The second groups, 95% of them were taken out of the Pioneer Corps, though their training was very similar. But it was a different trajectory for these guys, except for the first Dieppe group and the first guy, George Lane.
Okay. Mark Harris asks,
and this Mark Harris, hey Mark, Mark's dad is Ian Harris, the guy, the Clark Gable gentleman who got everyone to surrender and got that medal saying that nobody had ever seen heroics like the great Ian Harris. Sorry, go ahead.
Thanks for being with us, Mark. He asks, are there stories that are still classified?
There are still some stories that are classified for about 50 more years, but it seems to be that those are mostly personnel material. Like I was able to declassify a bunch of those. There's some that's still closed. In terms of the special operations they did in advance of the war, those are unreachable. I cannot get my hands on those. So I think that there's still a lot more stories to tell. And also, as for the Enigma Pinch and Miriam Rothschild, I wanted to make a much more direct correlation with her work. And so I got in touch with Bletchley to just round out the Dieppe story. And Bletchley told me that all her files had disappeared. So, I'm sure they did disappear, but there's still stories to be told. This is the first work trying to get out there, but I want to find out those stories about people who went behind enemy lines. And that happened, but I can't get that material yet.
I'm going to squeeze in one more, and then I'll ask you for your final thoughts before we wrap up. So Peter wonders, is there a movie in the future?
I have a movie agent with CAA, and we've gotten a bunch of people, mostly documentaries, asking, and I just passed them all on because I can't believe this could possibly. This is all just making my head spin too much. So who knows what will happen? But I'm hopeful something will happen in the future. Things seem to be in the works, but we'll see.
Well, that's exciting. Thanks to everyone who joined us tonight, and thank you both so much. Now's the time to share any final thoughts you might have before we wrap up.
I would just like to say that during these real hard weeks we've all been happening with the news and all these things going on, I just want to say that I felt such a privilege getting to write this incredibly optimistic stories of these sort of group of Jewish outcasts who nobody wanted, who went on and changed the world. And to me, whenever I think about this story, I think about refugees and how important they are, and that these guys came and they righted the world. And so to me, it's been really nice to get to work on this over the last few years and think about these stories of these Jewish guys who fought back, particularly over these last months when things have been hard. And yeah, those are my final.
Well, I would just like to say again, thanks, Leah, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. It's a great book, and I think you're just at the start of a lot of interesting experiences as the book goes out into the world. I'd also just like to say a word of thanks to the folks who have made this all happen smoothly behind the scenes there, Mac and Magda and Daniel, and big thanks to Harold and everybody at Roosevelt House. And thank you, everybody, for coming, and thanks for your questions. And go out and buy the book. You won't be sorry.
Thank you, Benjamin. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.